So our next speaker is Cheryl Lassitter, who currently serves as the lead chemist for the National Seafood Inspection Laboratory in NOAA, at NOAA in Pascagoula, Mississippi. She has a bachelor's in geology with minors in chemistry, physics, and biology, a master's in environmental chemistry, and 2 years of work towards her PhD in physics and remote sensing. And she's going to share with us NOAA's fisheries and analytical response to the Gulf oil spill.
Okay, so I am going to discuss with you all the NOAA analytical response, immediate analytical response to the oil spill, and this will fold in pretty nicely with Richard's talk. It's going to be brief, so we'll start. So the oil spill occurred on Tuesday, April 20th, 2010, and then NOAA immediately responded to that. We had analytical procedures initiated for the testing of Gulf of Mexico seafood. So the goal of our 2010 response was to ensure public safety and consumer confidence in Gulf of Mexico seafood while reopening the closed areas very carefully, but as expeditiously as possible. So we looked at two things. We looked at the polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, which have been mentioned just before. The FDA has established levels of concern for these PAHs in seafood, and we tested the seafood according to these levels of concern. And then also we had sensory or organoleptic testing of the PAHs. We also tested for dispersants, which are the Corex at 9500 and the Corex at 9527. And these were used for breaking up the oil slicks. They have low human toxicity. They do not accumulate in seafood, and they break down rapidly and become highly dispersed in Gulf waters. Also, we didn't test for thousands of samples for mercury and arsenic, but just to mention it, they do have a very small component in crude oil, but it's normally in the ppb range. So to protect the public from the DWH contaminated seafood, we used a three-pronged approach. We did precautionary closures of a very large area that I will show you in a map in a few minutes. We had a strict reopening protocol, and then also surveillance was carried out. For the precautionary closures, we had a closure of fishing and shellfish harvest areas that were likely exposed to the oil, that we would guess might be exposed to the oil. We monitored fish that were caught just outside the closed areas, as well as the closed areas. And then we also had enforcement from NOAA's Office of Law Enforcement, and then also the U.S. Coast Guard and the states. For our strict reopening protocol, for the sensory, absolutely, there could be no oil smelled in the seafood samples. And then, of course, with our seafood testing, we had chemical and sensory. I really wasn't involved in the sensory testing, but we do have experts that can address that if anyone has questions. And for the surveillance, we had the air on-water monitoring, 3 post-opening seafood samplings, dockside and seafood processing facilities monitoring, and then also long-term seafood and environmental monitoring. Now, the National Seafood Inspection Laboratory, or NOAA, and then also our Seattle office, we did not do the long-term monitoring. That was left to some other NOAA folks, but it was not us. We just did the testing for about a year or two. So this is an extensive area that, for a map that you've already kind of seen. We did precautionary closures, and then we also did closures right around the spill. And what we were looking for when we tested all these sites were different levels of PAHs. We tested for about 13 PAHs, or polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, in the seafood. So for the chemical testing, we did 2 chemical tests. The first screening that we did was an HPLC FLD method, or HPLC fluorescence detection, and then we also used a very sensitive GC mass spec method to confirm the results. Also, we tested for dispersants. We wanted to make sure that there weren't too many dispersants in the water, or in the actual seafood, rather. We tested in the seafood as well as the oil. And all of the samples tested in the federal waters, we found were well below the FDA's level of concern, routinely 100 to 1,000 times below that level of concern. And we did muscle testing, and we also tested for the hepatopancreas in shellfish. So this table shows us what the FDA PAH levels of concern are. And if you notice in this chart, the dibenz-AH anthracene and the benzoate pyrene are absolutely the most toxic. Those are the most carcinogenic. And the least carcinogenic are the naphthalene, the fluorine, and the anthracene. So what we were looking for is the toxicity equivalent. So we gauged the dibenz-anthracene in the benzoate pyrene against everything else, because we want to see lower levels of that than we do any of the PAHs. These other PAHs are not as carcinogenic. So this diagram, which was done by Dr. Calvin Walker back during the spill, shows us what we actually found. And we routinely found hundreds to thousands of times below the FDA's level of concern. This is for naphthalene, both in fish and shrimp. And this diagram just shows you how dramatically low these amounts were that we found. That's the chemical structure of naphthalene. Just as well, this diagram is a combination of phenanthrene and anthracene, which are the lower toxicity PAHs. And again, we found extremely low levels with what we actually tested, that you can see at the bottom of the graph, with the FDA's level of concerns, which are at the top for the fish and the shrimp. And then the most dangerous component, the benzoate pyrene, we just did not see much of anything. And we tested, say, around 12,500 samples of all kinds of species, and we just did not find it with either our screening method or the confirmatory GC mass spec methods. So this chart combines all of the PAHs, where we're actually looking at all 13 of them and all of our different species. And as you can clearly see at the bottom of the graph, what we actually found was well below anything that we might expect to be dangerous. And those clear circles just above are results that we achieved with a GC mass spec, which is by far the most sensitive instrument as compared to the FLD. Just did not find anything. So what about the dispersants? We also tested for the dispersants, which were widely spread across the water. The dispersants were used to actually break up the oil, as discussed before. So we wanted to make sure that there weren't too much of the dispersants in the water, even though they do have low toxicity. So the key component that we look for in the dispersants is DOS, or dioctyl sodium sulfosuccinate, also DOS. And this chart shows what we found in fish as well as shrimp, and everything that we could find was way, way below the FDA's level of concern. So the dispersants really broke up very quickly. The microbes took care of the oil. We just did not see them in the muscle of the tissue or the hepatopancreas. We did not test the water. We only test the seafood, because that's what we were concerned with. How can we open these areas? We want to make sure that they're safe before we do reopen them. So if anyone has any further questions on this, there are two sources here, and also I'd be glad to answer questions. The first is a website from NOAA, fisheries.noaa.gov, region/Southeast, and then also there's a 1-888 FDA number that you can call if you have any additional questions. We only tested for about 1.5 to 2 years directly following the oil spill, because again, we just weren't finding anything in the actual seafood, but there was environmental monitoring that was done by other organizations, but not us. So that's all I have. Thank you.